Hello, guys. So today we are going to talk about the Reformation spreading to a variety of different countries and some of the main people involved with it. And so let's just kind of jump into it. Now, what we need to understand actually before I start, I'm sorry, is that there are lots and lots of different groups that broke off. I'm going to talk about kind of some of the bigger ones, some of the more impactful ones, but most certainly it's not all of them, because remember, we only have time for a certain amount. So let's just get into it. So, undoubtedly, the largest group of Protestants that will exist aside from the Lutherans during this particular time will be a group that will be founded by a man by the name of John Calvin or Jean Calvin. Calvin? Sure. He is French and he was from the middle class. Grew up Catholic, much like everyone else in Europe. And he was influenced as a young man when his father was excommunicated, not for being a heretic or not speaking out against the church, but because he had a little bit of a financial issue with the church and issues with money and whatnot. And that really kind of soured him. He had started to study to become a priest, so he was pretty versed in religion, although at his father's urging, he would leave to pursue law. But when his father died, he went back to his studies as a priest. But then Lutheranism comes, and he is absolutely transformed by it. In 1533, he meets some French Lutherans, and whereas he doesn't necessarily buy into completely with the Lutheran aspect of it, he definitely started looking at the church in a different way and started to formulate kind of his own belief system. At that point, things for Protestants in France were pretty dangerous. Francis I, who was the king at the time, was ultra Catholic, so many French Lutherans or other Protestants were leaving, and so he will leave and move to Geneva, which will kind of be like this safe zone, and eventually he will come to actually rule Geneva, as we'll see in a little bit. All right, so Calvin eventually here really develops and formulates his theology into what becomes known as Calvinism. And the key aspect here is this idea of predestination, okay? And here's how it works. Man is basically incapable of adding anything to himself to ensure salvation from God. And God has predetermined your life and whether or not you will achieve salvation. Okay, and that is because man, by his nature alone, is morally and spiritually unable to follow God on his own. So God intervenes to set you up on the path. Okay, but the only way to, I guess, prove or to understand that you're one of the predestined is to believe in the Gospels and follow the word of the gospel. And that's going to be really, really important. Okay, and so that's the basics of predestination, and Calvin actually breaks this all down into 5 major points, okay, and I'm going to go over them here, and you can pause so you can write stuff down and stuff like that. So the first point is this idea of total depravity, that again, because of the fall of man, because of what Adam and Eve did, we are unable to follow God on our own. We are descended by those who disobeyed God, because that was the big sin there, so this all comes down to us, okay, which then leads to unconditional election. God chooses people based on his mercy alone, not because of good works and not because of merit. And you're probably like, well, why doesn't everybody go crazy like the purge or something like that? We'll get there. Then we go to limited atonement, that Jesus' death only abates the sins of the elect, not all mankind, which is definitely a separation a little bit of the initial ideas behind Christianity. Now, irresistible faith. This is where we're determining who is good, bad, whatnot. God draws his elect to the Gospels and the saving grace of Christ. So, if you are drawn to follow the Gospel and the Word of God, if you will, that is, you are being chosen to be one of the elect. Okay, so that's what prevents like all the crazy purgeness, because you wouldn't be following the ideas of God if you weren't one of the elect. And then finally, the perseverance of saints. Saints are those who have been set apart by God. Saints are not someone deemed holy by the church. That's important to understand. Okay, so the idea here is deep belief in the gospel, following the words of Jesus, okay, focusing on those types of things. Again, with the key difference being again, total, the predestination. Now, life under Calvin was very interesting, as I have Calvin and Hobbes, Calvin being very important. If you want to pause and read the cartoon, feel free, because Calvin and Hobbes is great. So eventually Calvin comes to control Geneva, and they basically run it via a theocracy. Calvin, this is actually a statue of some of the main influencers in Geneva. Calvin is right here. Okay, and basically it was run by a committee of elders, and life was very, very strict. So it was a theocracy, so all of them were considered to be part of the elect. The priests were separated out a little bit. Economics was actually a big deal. We'll talk about this. Under Calvin, he also had an understanding of economics that commercial expansion was very important. And if I jump down real quick, I probably should have work ethic next to it. Something develops known as the Protestant work ethic. One of the big things that we see, which not that it wasn't in Christianity, but becomes a focus a lot of these Protestant groups, is that hard work is important and that hard work needs to be valued. We literally refer to it as the Protestant work ethic, that they are going to outwork you in developing just about anything. And it's going to be very interesting that much of the science that ends up getting developed will end up coming out of Protestant countries, because in a lot of cases they're embracing of this. Although he was frighteningly intolerant. If you were not a Calvinist, he wanted you out, and he may actually kill you if that was the case. Very, very intolerant of other religions. It was really, really rough. And your day-to-day life was actually really strict. He was very much against like songs, and it was just stern, and punishments were often like, here of like the stocks or people being punished in public. That's what it was all about. However, there was something about this religion that called people, and it would spread. In France, the Calvinists were known as Huguenots. In England, they would be known as the Pilgrims or Puritans. They end up getting established in Scotland under a man by the name of John Knox. It's really, really huge, and probably the biggest one outside of Luther. Then there was a different group that was even more transformatory, because like Lutheranism and Calvinism, they still had kind of a hierarchy, and they still had priests, and you still focused on the gospel, and a lot of them still had different forms of the sacraments. But then come this group called the Anabaptists, and literally they're, I think, probably one of the more rebellious ones, and they were hated by everyone, and I do mean everyone. So Anabaptism is really radical, and this gives you a map of kind of where Anabaptism was spreading. So they feel that church is actually a voluntary thing, and that baptism is more spiritual than a ceremony, okay? So the Anabaptists, in many cases today, they lost the Ana and are referred to more as Baptists, that baptism happens in adulthood, because you should never force a faith on someone. That was one of their big, big things. You can instruct children, you can instruct young people, but they have to be an adult to actually accept it. Okay. They also believe that all believers are equal, and that local areas should choose their own minister. That's right. So we're not looking at a priest. We're looking at what you would kind of refer to as a pastor today, and that would be chosen by the populace. And they basically run a stripped down version of Christianity. The services are really discussions about God and Jesus. There's no ceremonies. There's really no sacraments. So we're getting away from the Eucharist. That's kind of a big deal. And they do believe in a complete separation of church and state. The Anabaptists, because they were very dedicated to their religion, they would not hold government office. And they were also abstained from violence. This might change a little bit later for some groups, but that was a big, big thing. And so they're very, very different. And as a result, they're really going to be heavily persecuted. The Holy Roman Empire was absolutely brutal. During the peasant revolt that we talked about, they would actually be driven out of most of the Holy Roman Empire. If I pop back, here's the Holy Roman Empire. They would start here, right? So this is to 1550. But then after 1550, they're moving up here. This is modern day Poland. They're going to move out into France. They're going to move up into England and lots of other places. But they are going to be attacked pretty brutally. Eventually, they'll find some cities where they can just kind of concentrate where they're at, and Munster would be the main one. It was the first place Munster was the first place they were legally recognized. But eventually, you get a sect of Anabaptism, which will bring on even more persecution, and that is the Mechiorites. The Mechiorites believed that the end of the world was at hand, and they were a bit more aggressive, that if you don't follow us, we're all going to die. They wanted to form what they called a New Jerusalem, so they booted anyone that wasn't Anabaptist out of Munster, and they burned all their books except for the Bible. Unfortunately for them, that angered both Catholics and Lutherans, and they would be the city of Munster would eventually be retaken by both Catholics and Lutherans working together, and all the leaders of the Mechiorites would be executed. So yeah, but the religion itself didn't die. It would spread, and then it would start to change a little bit into something we see today, and something known as the Mennonites. The Mennonites were founded by Menno Simons. Their beliefs are, at their core, Anabaptist, but they did believe in separatism. So they're going to be persecuted so much, they're like, fine, you want to persecute us, whatever, we are going to leave. And then he starts to form these communities, Menno Simons, in moving away from everybody else. Okay, and that's the whole idea. A big focus on hard work and communal living, and really, really strict discipline to the Bible. And if you didn't work and you didn't go to services and stuff, they basically kicked you out. So that was a little bit different. Another group that formed out of them, and they're very closely today, would be the Amish. Basically, the Amish were a sect of Mennonites, the first group led by Jacob Ammon, who their beliefs are very, very similar, but they went to continue rejecting modern society as it would get older. Like modern day Mennonites will use like electricity and things like that. They dress very similar to, like, over here you might be like, oh, they're a bunch of Amish. No, they're not. They are Mennonite. But the Amish basically reject modern technology because they feel that, one, it's not doing the Lord's work, and two, it can kind of lead them astray. And so with all these groups, and eventually I'm going to be talking about like Presbyterians and all sorts of different groups that come out, but these are like the big ones that are really active, and they're going to play a really large role in different types of things that we're going to follow. But what we have here is just, when Luther opens that floodgate, man, it just goes and goes and goes, and we're going to continue to get groups as we move on, okay? All right, so make sure you complete your assignment, and I'll see you guys soon.